Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 9th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, Jesus said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I've come to call not the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then, suddenly, a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, for she said to herself, "If only I touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up, and the report of this spread throughout the district. The gospel of the Lord. Good morning, dear people. Before I launch into today's gospel, which, as you noted, jumped from one story to another like a pogo stick, I want to say it's good to be back with you after 3 weeks away. In those 3 weeks, a lot has happened here. You finished the season of creation, you celebrated Pentecost, you welcomed a new member, Catherine, you elected new council members at your annual meeting, your call committee's been hard at work, you transitioned to the new tech room at the back of the sanctuary, and many more things, all in 3 weeks. I have been in Scotland and Scandinavia seeing relatives. In Scotland, I want to be truthful, I went not only for the gorgeous scenery, but also in search of good whiskey and a bit of Celtic spirituality with its earth-centeredness. Scotland is known for smoky whiskey on the island of Islay in particular, and Gaelic or Celtic spirituality on the island of Iona. And I found both of these, whiskey and spirituality, but much more intertwined with one another than I expected. I thought, well, there would be the whiskey, there would be the spirituality, but they wouldn't be like, this. Both islands, Islay, and that is spelled, by the way, I-S-L-A-Y, if you go to the liquor store and you look at the kinds of scotch, but they say Islay. Both Islay and Iona are on the west of Scotland, in the west, which is deeply connected to Gaelic or Celtic culture with roots in Ireland. Our gathering hymn, "Morning is Broken," it wasn't in the copyright, but the tune, does anybody know what the tune of that is? It's Bunasan. It's Bunasan. You can see that in your hymnal. Well, there's a town called Bunasan, and I rode through it, and it's on the Isle of Mull, on the way to Iona. The Gaelic word for whiskey is ushka beta, which means, does anybody know? It means water of life. Water of life. Arriving in Scotland after weeks of sermons and worship here at ULC, focused on water, and trees, and earth, and animals, and stars, it felt to me like an extension of the season of creation in Scotland. Ushka Bay, the water of life. So I found that the production of whiskey on Islay, at least, was so deeply entwined with the people of the land, the people, the peaty land, the sea, and a palpable sense of connectedness to a generous creator, all interwoven. So I'll stop the travelogue. Time to come to the gospel. But if any of you want to chat more with me about this, I would love to do that at coffee hour. So if you had a little trouble following the gospel this morning in Matthew, especially without the words in front of you, you're not alone. There are at least 4 different storylines in the space of 14 verses, interrupting each other in midstream. So let's look at it, go through it again. So it begins with Jesus walking along and seeing Matthew the tax collector. Jesus called Matthew to follow him, and Matthew did just that. The next verse puts them at a dinner. We don't know whose house it was, who the host was, but the guests included not only Matthew, but other sinners as well, those who would be excluded from the dinner tables of law-abiding Jews of their day. So the guests also included some Pharisees who interrogated Jesus' companions. And then while Jesus is responding, a leader of the synagogue bursts in and says his daughter has died, but Jesus can make her alive again. So this is interruption number 1. Jesus got up and followed him, but then there's interruption number 2. En route, a woman reaches out to touch the fringe of Jesus' garment, trusting that if she did so, she would be healed of the bleeding that had plagued her for 12 years. Jesus acknowledged her, called her daughter, and she was made well. And then we're back on track. With the first interruption, Jesus returns to follow the synagogue leader to his home where the mourners had already gathered. And they mocked Jesus when he said the daughter was only sleeping, but Jesus took the young woman's hand and raised her to life. All of this in 14 verses. So can we find a thread or a couple threads or themes through this jumble, or should we just look at 1 or 2 of these stories? I've done the latter a couple times, but today I want to look at a couple threads or themes that I found that I think can be instructive to us today. I find in them a message, first of all, about faith, and of course that's very prominent in our other readings as well for today, and then about the ministry of the church. So first, faith. This is not the first time that I've preached about faith. In other sermons, I have talked about the relationship of faith and doubt, and the idea that faith is not certainty about church doctrine or ideas about God, but that faith is more trusting God's love for us and about letting ourselves be led by Jesus. We also talked about this idea of faith when we had our class on Baptize We Live this spring. In our gospel today, we see the contrast between those with faith as trust on the one hand, that is Matthew, the woman who touched Jesus' clothing, and the leader of the synagogue who came to Jesus. And then on the other hand, those whose faith is more tied up in the observance of certain religious rules. The account we heard leaves me as the reader with a lot of questions. Why would Matthew just get up from his tax booth and follow Jesus? Why would the leader of a synagogue, maybe a Pharisee himself, burst into a dinner party to beg Jesus to come and touch his dead daughter? Why would that poor woman who had been bleeding for 12 years publicly humiliate herself by pushing through a crowd of people just to touch the hem of Jesus' cloak? It reminds me of my wonderment sometimes when a person shows up here on a Sunday morning that has never been in this building before. And we know in the city, it's a completely non-normal thing to go to church on a Sunday. I mean, it's just not normal. And I wonder, what brings them here? What are they looking for? Each of these people in this text today from Matthew had some faith that Jesus had the power to offer them new life in one way or another. Matthew, with his dead-end job, who was despised by many in his community for collecting taxes for the Romans. The father who had more power, but was powerless in the face of his daughter's death. And then that woman whose constant bleeding made her unclean, and therefore, according to religious rules, an outsider in her community, even in her own family. These three, they were all trapped in their circumstances. They needed new life, and they believed that perhaps they could receive that from Jesus. The saying goes that there are no atheists in foxholes, that desperate circumstances can make a believer of anybody. Or a cynic might say, in desperate circumstances, why wouldn't you try anything? The Gospels show us a Jesus who has an affinity for such folks. Jesus gravitated toward those on the margins, those excluded by others because of who they were or what they had done, those with little in the way of resources, those who know they couldn't save themselves even if they had resources, or they couldn't save the ones they loved. Jesus' people, I would include us in that are here this morning, we have to get used to relating to people of the margins because that's what Jesus did. If we want to sit at the table with Jesus, we're probably going to be sitting with others that might make us uncomfortable in one way or another. I've already alluded to another aspect of this text that I think is important for us, especially as we contemplate the leader of the synagogue in this story, whose daughter had died. Again, he was a leader of the synagogue. He had reputation. He undoubtedly had some resources and some power in the community. And eventually, those of us who might identify with him, who also have some stature, some resources, might find ourselves at the margins, if only for a time. Maybe when we're laying in a hospital bed, wondering if we're going to get better, or when we find ourselves unable to face the loss of a loved one for a long period of time, unable to get over it, when we have our private doubts about the goodness of life. I imagine you can think of times in your own life where you felt you were kind of at the end of your rope, needing God, needing Jesus to bring you healing and hope. It is in those moments, those end-of-the-rope moments, that Jesus wants us to come to him and to trust that he can make us new again. The new life that these three people in Matthew's gospel received from Jesus was not an end of itself. We know in Matthew's story, we know a little bit that he became one of the 12 apostles, that he carried on the ministry of Jesus. We don't have a lot of detail about that, but we assume he continued Jesus' ministry of welcoming outcasts and inviting people to new life and of spreading the good news of God's reign of shalom for all creation. But I expect that the woman that was cured of her bleeding and the leader of the synagogue, I expect, even though we don't know their names, that they also became disciples of Jesus, that they testified to what they had received from Jesus, just like other testimonies we've heard, the Samaritan woman, for example. So this leads me from my first thread in those interwoven stories, from the theme of faith to the second thread, the theme of ministry. One of the words that recurs in this passage is the word follow, or some equivalent of that. So Jesus called Matthew to follow him, but then a bit later, it is Jesus who does the following. When the leader of the synagogue came to Jesus, and Jesus followed him to help with his daughter. like Matthew, like Mary Magdalene, and all the other disciples, we are called to follow Jesus. And as followers of Jesus, we invite others to be followers as well. Come and join us in our worship, in our service, in our advocacy. Come and be part of our faith community. Yet if we heed this gospel today, there are times when someone will come to us as a church or as individual Christians and ask for our help and ask us to follow them. And they will lead us. They will guide us to the place where we can be of service, where we can be agents of God's life-giving power. So think for a minute of what voices from the margins have had a role in leading this congregation into ministry. Some of you who've been here for a while may think of voices of specific women without homes whose stories might have led in part of leading this congregation to give birth to the Elizabeth Gregory Home. What voices and stories of queer men and women and non-binary folks led this congregation to publicly stand with the LGBTQIA+ community in advocacy and in celebration, as we're doing in this month of Pride? During the season of creation at ULC, what voices from the other than human species and elements of creation, the earth, the water, the trees, the animals, spoke to us and called us to care for God's earth? I'm thinking again of my picture of Jamoke, the gorilla at the zoo. The call to follow Jesus on the journey to well-being for all God's creation comes to the well-heeled and to the down and out. The call to follow takes us sometimes to places where it's hard to be, whether protesting at City Hall or sitting by the bed of a sick friend. But it can be at those times and places that the power of Jesus for new life comes to us and to the world. The power to lift up those who have been pushed down, to restore what has been broken and divided, to give hope to the weary of heart or those at the end of their rope. We simultaneously are the ones who are in need of the saving power ourselves, and the ones who are called and sent out to help bring healing and wholeness to others. And we're given new life again and again so that we can be partners with God in bringing liberation and new life. Thanks be to God. Amen.